Ladies and gentlemen, our program will now begin. Please welcome the CEO of Churchill Club, Karen Tucker.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you all tonight. Thank you so much for coming out for this discussion. Tonight we are exploring the opportunities and risks around the use of AI algorithms to support or even make different types of business decisions. We have with us an amazing group of people and minds to address the topic, starting with Warren Barkley, GM of AWS Machine Learning Group, of course, Amazon Web Services, Paula Goldman, Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer at Salesforce, Rachel Thomas, Founding Director of the USF Center for Applied Data Ethics and also co-founder of fast.ai, Jonathan Zunger, Distinguished Engineer and Chief Ethics Officer from Humane, and Kevin Collins, Managing Director, Software and Platform Services, Accenture, is here to guide them in conversation. Bring you up in a moment, but welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. Big thanks to Accenture, including Julie Rosendahl and Kevin Collins, for invaluable support and assistance in creating this occasion for all of us. They're continually looking around corners and through their periscopes, and we have a lot of really great conversations about what comes next, and so this is one example of that tonight. If this is your first time attending a Churchill Club program, I'm pleased to offer just a very brief introduction. We were founded in 1985, actually, kicking off with a program by Intel's Bob Noyce, very controversial at the time. The topic was offshoring. And today we say that our mission is to strengthen innovation, economic growth, and social good. Through programs such as we have tonight, which are topic-centric, we look for what's new, next, not widely known. So we try to pick up where conversations and information that's out there already leave off. And particularly under-discussed insights. So before we bring up our speakers, there is just one more thing to tell you, and that is that the hashtag is Churchill Club. Let's bring our speakers up now, our panel up now. Thank you. Sorry, I went the wrong way.
The hardest part of the whole thing, right? It's just getting up here.
That's the test, actually.
Right? Failed. Okay. Thank you all for being here. I really do appreciate it. As Karen said, my name is Kevin Collins. I'm part of our software and platforms industry team at Accenture, and I also run a thing called Web Scale Services, which is a business we started a few years back that really seeks to take intelligent operations and figure out how to use that to transform things that we've done historically just with people. So as you can imagine, tonight's topic is something that's near and dear to my heart. Before we get started, let me just shower a little appreciation on Karen and the Churchill Club team. They do these things over and over and over again. They always come out great. I can tell you, having looked behind the curtain a few times, that it is not easy. Even though it looks easy, it is not. Managing the venues and getting the word out and then managing the schedules, collective schedules of leaders like this is not easy. And this time, just because it was, why not, right? Let's add, it's the end of the summer vacation season and Thursday before a 3-day weekend, and let's just see if we can do that. So, so thank you for that. And then thank you also to our panelists who took time out of their busy schedules to come and have a conversation that I think is just really important and one that we need to be having quite a bit. So to our topic. For 100 years, we've been worried about the robot takeover, right? You can go back to the 1950s and see magazine covers about how factory automation is going to lead to the collapse of society. And it's been a big deal, and we've been talking about it for a long, long time. And as these systems have become more intelligent and more capable, those fears have only gone up. And it's not just anti-tech Luddites. It is some of our most tech-savvy, most forward-thinking luminaries who are raising concerns. So I think the robot takeover is an interesting conversation, but it's actually not tonight's conversation. We're not going to do that. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to try to plant a foot on either side of it. We're going to take one foot and we're going to plant it on the more practical side. And we're going to talk a little bit about a case that I think is a lot more prevalent, which is you working side by side with intelligent systems, with algorithms, you working in collaboration with them. And how does that work? And how do you manage it? And how do you structure it? In fact, the title of this program, Putting Algorithms in the Org Chart, came from a conversation that I had with a client who wanted to basically do like an audit of her algorithms, and quickly found out, I don't even know where they all are. Like, I don't even have an inventory, let alone an audit. And so as she started to think about this problem, these are not just execution algorithms, these are decision-making algorithms. And I have these decision makers all over my company. The old days when I had decision makers that looked like us, right? I had a whole system of checks and balances. I had a whole way of identifying if bad decisions were being made. And I had a way of training or coaching or putting governance around, or in worst case, getting rid of bad decision makers, right? But algorithms are being deployed, and a lot of that is not in place. So she said, I think I need an org chart of my algorithms just to understand where they all are and what decisions they're making. So that's one foot. The other foot is more on the strategic and even the ethical side, and we're going to ask questions about, as algorithms continue to proliferate through our companies and through our customers, what responsibilities does that bring to us, right? Like, what do we have to do differently? How does my job change? Also, how do I think about what I'm responsible, what obligations I have to tell my customers about when they're engaging with these bots, right? How do I do that? So I hope we're going to dance back and forth between that very practical and very, I don't want to say theoretical, but for the very ethical side of the world over and over again. Format-wise, I'll ask half a dozen, 9 questions. We'll kind of run through it. We will leave lots of time for your questions because, as always in these sessions, there's some very smart people in the audience. There's a lot of really good questions out there, and we want to make sure that you have time to get yours up there. Okay? Okay. So for our topic, I don't really think we could have asked for a better group of people. Karen mentioned kind of who they are, what their titles are, but really interesting set of experiences, both practical and theoretical here, can really understand a lot of the problems that we're facing. So before we start with sets of questions, maybe we can just quickly go down the line and talk a little bit about, how did you get here? What's your background in this space, and how do you think about our topic tonight? You want to start?
Yeah, sure. I was originally a musician, symphony musician, so that's how I got here. But,
awesome. So for intermission?
Yeah. A long time ago, and I started in technology many years ago, worked at Microsoft, did some startup stuff, ran a public company. And when it was about 2012, when I was running this company, I started getting interested in data science and AI in a kind of a serious way. And so I hired a research team of a bunch of PhDs, and that was kind of my side project, experimenting with a bunch of different models and things like that, algorithms. And that was kind of my introduction into data science. I went to Microsoft, worked in the AI team there, and now I work at Amazon. So, and I think the topic's super important, and it's really super interesting that we're talking about this now. In this arc of development, we're at the very beginning of it in many ways. And so understanding, I think there's a real lack of understanding of what it is and what actually the problem set is and how do we address it as people. So,
thanks. Paula?
So I think my path is a little unusual. I'm an anthropologist by training. I got a PhD. I studied how unorthodox ideas become mainstream. So I'm fascinated about norms and how norms scale. And I'm also fascinated, basically spent my career in startups, nonprofit, for-profit, sort of tech for social good, essentially. And a couple of years ago, I was working for Pierre Omidyar at the time, the guy that started eBay. And we just had this moment. It's like, oh, tech for good's no longer enough. we need to like really be thinking about the consequences of tech at scale, and started a tech ethics practice for him. Then joined Salesforce to lead our work of embedding ethics into our tech. So I come to this conversation with that lens, right, which is saying we're in the midst of this massive transformation where we actually can't even begin to understand the consequences of the technology that is spreading in the world, but actually it's incumbent on us to imagine to the best of our capacity those consequences and try to get ahead of them.
Okay, so my background, I have a PhD in math, and actually I found that to be a really toxic environment and ended up becoming a software engineer and data scientist, and found that to be a really toxic environment, and I'd always kind of had an interest in social good and social justice, but got increasingly interested in kind of diversity and how these toxic environments were bad for that. And 3 years ago, started fast.ai with the goal of making deep learning, making AI more accessible to a much broader group of people. And I see that as kind of this, wanting people from more backgrounds to take advantage of the positives, but also to address the risk and harms we're seeing. And then became kind of increasingly drawn into those risks and harms. And then much more recently, just in the past few months, have launched the Center for Applied Data Ethics at the University of San Francisco.
And excuse me. So I started out as a theoretical physicist, and I also found it to be an incredibly toxic environment. It's kind of a theme here. And left that to join what was then a small company called Google. I spent the next several years building up a lot of the very technical, like the search mechanisms and the storage, the systems infrastructure. And in 2011, I became a technical leader for Google's social division, which included a pretty wide range of products at the time, and quickly discovered that the kind of technical leadership they needed didn't have as much to do with operating systems as with problems of privacy, abuse, policy, all these very complicated things that involved humans. And as a result, over the next couple of years, I basically morphed into Google's Department of Weird Stuff, dealing with all of the most terrifying and awful things involving humans. And then 2 years ago, I decided it was time to do something a little different. And so now I'm at Humane, a small company started by Laszlo Bock, where we are trying to make work better for people at scale and trying to continue that kind of, this kind of work.
So if you run across anyone who thinks that you just kind of start at the bottom of the ladder and you just climb the ladder like this, show them this video, right? Okay, so like I said, exactly an interesting, diverse set of opinions, hopefully non-toxic, for us to talk about about this issue. And I just want to start with sort of one of these Columbo type questions, which is kind of why now? Like we've been talking about algorithms and we've been talking about automation for a really long time. And so why is it important for us to have this conversation now as opposed to 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 10 years from now? What is it about this moment that's changing that makes you think that now is the right time to talk about this?
We should have probably had this conversation 10 years ago.
Yeah, no. But you were playing trombone.
I think we should have, right? I mean, some of the problems that we encounter that are around machine learning and AI are not unique to those areas, right? They just may accelerate certain parts of it. But I mean, some of the things around search and privacy and all the things that we had in the past have been there for at least 10 years. So I think that maybe we're at the point now where we're seeing data and compute and things like that with machine learning and the ability for it to do much more complex decision making and things like that. So people become more worried about it, more heightened about the possibility of what it could be. And so I think that awareness is just kind of triggered on in the last little bit. But
so the problem has been there, but now people are just becoming more aware of it.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I would agree with that and just say I think it's happening at a larger scale now, and that also tech is exacerbating a lot of existing problems in society and really kind of leveraging those in a negative way to make them even worse at scale.
Yeah, I think I might even go farther and say that AI can often be a bit of a red herring in these conversations. That the problems we're discussing, we should have been having this conversation 20 and 30 years ago too.
Yeah.
Because generally when you see a problem involving AI, you dig a bit deeper, it's actually a problem involving people and who put that AI there and why. And I think the good thing is it's pulling this up to the surface. But
So one of the arguments that you hear sometimes is, well, it's because the AI now is making decisions, right? It's not just executing on what we tell it to do. It's now making decisions. Sounds like you don't buy that one. Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about that? Like, yeah, I hear that a lot.
I was going to say, you need to also, in a lot of these cases, people get kind of hyper-focused on the algorithm or on the AI, but you really need to think about the system that it's within and all the kind of human processes around it and the human institutions and existing processes that it's plugged into, because that's often where you kind of get these negative effects. And then also kind of even thinking just about the algorithm, there are so many human decisions that go into what data to use and how to frame the problem and what to be doing.
I also think if you take a huge step back, we're in this moment of huge societal anxiety, right? Yeah. And people are, at the heart of some of the so-called tech clashes, questions about like, have algorithms affected our elections? Questions like that, right? And so who's making those decisions and why? It's those types of broader context that's then trickling down to these types of business decision questions that are now in the crosshairs.
So that leads to. So let me ask this question: do you think is there a way to categorize? Is there a way to set a set of criteria that says, you know what, in these cases we shouldn't use algorithms at all? Is that a fair thing to say? We're going to quarantine these kinds of decisions, and we're only going to use them over here where it's okay.
I don't think that's quite the right way to split it. What I'd say is, okay, where might you use an algorithm? If you have a manual process that you've started to understand and has started to become repeatable, that's a perfect place to start to automate it with an algorithm.
Okay.
And that includes decision making, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of very repetitive parts of decision making involving doing the research and things like that. And you just have to have some common sense. So for example, you have an AI that maybe helps you do the research for it, gives you even a preliminary decision, and then you sanity check it. And that's not because it's a fundamentally dangerous thing necessarily. It might just be because why on earth would you trust this thing? I mean, it doesn't necessarily know what it's doing. But on the other hand, you don't necessarily know what you're doing either. I think we really overestimate the quality of natural intelligence a lot.
Right.
So I think really the cases where you can use AI meaningfully is you have the cases where you're automating manual processes, in which case it integrates into a system just like you would integrate any other room full of well-intentioned idiots into a system. And the other case is the case where, to a certain extent, it doesn't matter, where it's going to make mistakes, and you think about what is the cost of different kinds of error, and you've decided, well, even with the worst errors it makes, that's totally okay, so let's ship this thing and do something that maybe you wouldn't even be able to do without the humans, because you've decided the errors are acceptable things. And if you put an algorithm in charge of your core business decisions, you deserve what you're about to get.
So then it's a risk analysis. It's a matter of, is the decision too big for an algorithm?
I wouldn't say it's too big. It's more like, I mean, these things are conceived by people and run by people, and understood in most cases by people. And I think that it's a question of, are you putting the right framework around it to know what comes out is, what's expected or not expected, that you're actually testing these things, right? Like, what are the limits? What are the counterfactuals? Do you understand what you've actually built? And there are ways to do that and ways to put frameworks around it. I don't think it's a question of where to use it and what to use it for, but you got to understand that we're fallible as people. These algorithms are just a reflection of us, right?
And I would just add to that the systems really need to consider mistakes and have a recourse for mistakes and think how you're going to minimize the damage from mistakes and catch them quickly, but not to assume that there won't be mistakes. I feel like it's where you get kind of the worst outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing, right? When people make decisions, we make mistakes all the time, but we have this whole system around us to catch and provide governance or provide, well, sure, you can point to examples where it failed, but it works a lot.
It also fails a lot.
Yeah, sure. So, but the question is, should we put these kind of systems around the algorithms? Because what I don't see is that being done consistently.
This is another place where I think the algorithm is a red herring. When people aren't putting systems around the algorithm, they are being lazy about something. And often when they're being lazy about something, every decision is actually the application of a value. And if they've decided to be lazy about this, that tells you about what they actually value.
I mean, one of the interesting documents that I came across lately was from the Federal Reserve, believe it or not, the Currency Control Office. And like the FinServ folks are really worried about explainability and understanding how they got from here to there and stuff. But they have a document about how do you manage models and how do you actually govern them and things like that. And I would suggest going and looking at that because it's got great ideas about how are you testing them, how are you boxing them. One of the interesting pieces that we do quite a bit is that we have this concept called bar raiser. And we use it for both interviewing and all sorts of things, but technical design, model building, and stuff like that as well. Whereas we have someone who's not in our line of business who comes in and then basically validates and peppers the designers and builders of that model and says, does this make sense? Is this the right thing to do? Is this the right design? Where's your data coming? How do you do this? And that person, a very independent person coming in and kind of being able to kind of look at your stuff and give you another perspective on it. I think you have to do things like that if you want to have great validation. And that's, in fact, in that document that I just talked about. They actually suggest that.
Yeah. To riff a bit on something Rachel was saying, which I thought was really important about errors and mistakes, engineering as a whole breaks into two major subjects. Product engineering is about how systems will work. And safety engineering is about how systems will fail. And in mature disciplines, like if you look at civil engineering, for example, there's not really a very big distinction between them. One of my childhood friends, he's a civil engineer. I would say he probably spends more time thinking about how the system could fail, like what is its stress, what happens if everything breaks. That's not his job. His job isn't safety engineer, he builds roads. On the other hand, you go into CS and you see a fleet of young product managers freshly graduated from college ready to change the world and disrupt something. I mean, I once heard someone with a straight face talking about disrupting retirement planning. I'm thinking, like, have you ever walked up to someone and said, I'm going to disrupt your retirement planning, and had them think that was a good thing? I think what we need to do is we need to consider safety engineering as a first-class thing. And especially when we are building these systems, in fact, in the high-impact system here, it's not that because there's an algorithm, but because I'd say the thing that really causes qualitative change is when something qualitatively changes the cost of something, right, of communication, of advertising, of transport, or something like that. When you're going to do something high-impact, or even if you're going to do something that you think is low-impact, you have to be thinking through the failure cases, thinking through the errors, and understanding how bad can things go. Because generally, how good things can go is bounded above. How bad things can go is not bounded below.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's an issue with a lot of tech companies are set up where product and engineering are kind of completely separate from trust and safety, but trust and safety absolutely should be kind of like informing the product decisions, or even in the same team. And I would just add kind of two groups that need to be kept closely involved are domain experts, and then also the people that will be impacted by by whatever the algorithm is. And it's really, I think, important to have representatives from both of those groups working closely on kind of what the algorithm is and foreseeing the impacts.
This is, I'm gonna like bring you guys into Salesforce. Like parade around. So you're talking about exactly what my role is at Salesforce. And I honestly think we're at a moment with these types of processes that we were in as an industry with security 15, 20 years ago, right? Where it's like security is a cost center. How could you possibly predict the way all the people would hack your system? And now you would not ship a major product without red teaming, right, for all these different vulnerabilities. And I think we're similarly there. And I think this gets to your question. So we're in the early days of thinking about what are the consequences of these algorithms in the world and building systems, both systems and processes that go into like the product roadmap, as well as kind of broader governance systems. And it's like day one. And we're kind of like taking metaphors from security and accessibility and other different places and then making it up, trying to figure out how to do it.
Yeah. Every day's day one. my company.
Oh, right.
That cost me $5.
But I do want to say there are academic fields like science, technology, and society, STS, that have been
absolutely.
studying this, but have often kind of not been included or incorporated into tech
Super
companies.
important.
Yeah.
I think
I
what-
completely agree.
Yeah, so a very good friend and collaborator of mine, Leah Kistner, she was a head of technical privacy for Google, and now she's chief privacy at Humu. She developed sort of what we might call like the modern product privacy approach, where instead of having the privacy team be this compliance-oriented team that's coming in and reviewing things, instead it has people who deeply understand privacy and respect for people, but also deeply understand products, and embeds them in every one of these teams from day one, so they're helping them with actually the entire process of design as well as training up the team members, because you can't retrofit this stuff. I mean, I've had so many teams come to me for privacy reviews who didn't think about it and thought, oh, we'll just get this checked off 2 weeks before we launch, which turned into 6 months before they launched because, and or several years before they launched because they had to throw everything out and redesign it. You can't hack this onto the side, and people keep trying to do that. And yeah.
So far we've been talking a lot about kind of within a company, right? Let's just broaden that for a minute and talk about what happens now as we start to provide algorithms outside the walls of my company, right? And so I think two questions immediately come to mind. The first one is, I now don't have control about how that's being used, right? I provide an algorithm to a customer, that customer goes and does what they do. How do I police that, if that's probably the wrong word? But how do I stay on top of that? How do I understand what's happening? How do I set some guidelines around that? And then how do you think about responsibility and recourse, I guess, around those kinds of questions once you release it into the ether?
I can speak to that, at least the first part of that question, because it's a large part of my job, right? So if you can look online right now at our Salesforce's acceptable use policy, and there's a few clauses about the use of our AI products, and one of them says, for example, if you're using these products to make decisions about things of legal significance, like, or the equivalent, who might get a loan, who might get a job, you need to have a human make that final decision, right? So there's a distinction, get to one of your earlier questions about which of these types of decision-making processes might be most risky, and we really need to be aware of it, There's also restrictions, like there's one in there that says if you're using a bot, you need to tell people you're using a bot, right? I think there's a handful of things that you can write into policy, and there's a lot of education work that's deeply needed because not many people besides me read acceptable use policies, and also because frankly, people are just getting started, don't know how to use these technologies, don't understand the downsides and the possible risks, and so I think that's one possible mechanism.
Just on that point,
Yeah.
is that common? Is everyone telling people when they're using a bot?
Telling people when they're using a bot, or telling people
When they're interacting with an algorithm?
that's not
'Cause
actually
I don't
very common.
think that's what I'm. I'm just curious. It's an interesting question, right? Is what responsibility do we have to disclose?
Again, I think we should go back to the question of the system, not the component, right? The fact that you're talking with a bot is rarely the important aspect of the question. I'm a little curious about what you meant in the question, because I think there's sort of a spectrum of ways this could be applied. So we have what Paula was just discussing, which is very similar to what I do in my own work, where as a company, we are providing a service using AI to provide information which a customer could horribly misuse, and we have to warn them very carefully. And in our case, we work very closely with customers to make sure they never try to use this information in the wrong way, because it would in fact have the opposite of the intended effect.
Okay.
But then you can start to move to the spectrum where, okay, then you have companies that are providing tools that will do decision making for a customer. And these can go very, very wrong. There's a case called Compass, which I think is sort of the infamous, really bad failure of that, which I'm sure we can talk about. And then you go all the way out to situations like AWS or at Google or a place like that, where you're actually providing AI as a tool to people. And of course, this is a dual use sort of tool. It can and absolutely will be used for malicious purposes as well, or for that matter, providing lots of data the way Facebook did through their lovely social graph API, which couldn't possibly have gone wrong. And so I think there's actually very different questions we're asking, and so I'm wondering where.
So please.
Yeah, no, I think that there's a lack of understanding. I mean, one of the things that when you talk to business people, they don't understand that technology was largely deterministic. AI and ML is largely probabilistic. That is actually a big difference, right? People understand that. I mean, Rachel's fast.ai site has some really great training on AI. People got to get educated on this. And in general, I think business decision makers don't understand it. And I think that technologists don't understand it. And I think that that's a big piece. We often get asked to come in and do talks, to engineers and stuff at different companies. But the reality is that if you don't have like an active education process in your technology group at whatever the company is about what is ML and AI, then there's going to be much bigger mistakes made, and it's going to be much harder for people to understand what's going on.
I think there also needs to be more of kind of thinking about how humans and computers work together and how to best leverage the strengths of both. Because I think a situation you see a lot is where someone has basically tried to totally automate what a human does, but of course can't quite automate that, and so then they put a human back in the loop, but in some weird suboptimal way, for instance, either something where the algorithms, maybe right 95% of the time, and you're expecting a human to catch the other 5%, even though we know that's what humans are horrible at, of, catching something that mostly works, or maybe the human is going to be held responsible if there's a failure, but they don't actually have the autonomy or power to meaningfully intervene. And so I think that those situations kind of often arise, though, out of this, let's just try to automate exactly what a person's doing. Okay, we can't really do that. Let's mesh these things together, as opposed to thoughtfully thinking, like, how could we leverage computers and humans?
Well, Rachel, can I invert that? So can we imagine a better version of that? So instead of the algorithm does it 95% of the time and then you're the fact checker for the 5, can you describe a scenario where it's merged together well, where the human and the AI are set up appropriately? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, no, I think that is a much harder task to describe what it looks like working well.
Well, yeah, I can give you a scenario, like legal documents. Anybody in here done diligence? What a painful process. Someone uploads 50,000 contracts to a data site. You now have to have how many hundred paralegals go through that contracts and find out what the limits of liability are. That's a perfect situation where you can use machine learning and comprehension to semantically understand which of those documents actually have terms and conditions that you need to actually review. You don't need to look at every document. You don't look at every page. It's a perfect thing for a lawyer. Now they're looking at, 1,000 documents. I'd still want to shoot myself. But it's not 50,000 documents. It's faster. It's whatever. The machine's really good at seeing those things. And the human's really good at making judgment calls about, is this really impactful on this acquisition or not? It's a perfect example of where those things can work together.
Actually, another example is from the fast.ai library. So there's like a key parameter you have to set, the learning rate. And basically, we run a process and then surface a graph that a human can kind of very easily interpret, because humans are good at kind of taking in visual information in picture form and find meaning from. And this is something that a lot of people have asked us, like, oh, can't you completely automate it, though, and just have it like spit out a number at the end? Like, why do I have to spend 2 seconds looking at this graph? And kind of not realizing there's like a lot of valuable information in the graph that you would lose if you tried to automate that last 1% of the process.
Yeah.
So why? No, please go.
I was going to say another really obvious example of search. It's a classic augmentative AI technology, right? This, we don't often think of it as an AI problem, but it's you utter a noun phrase, this thing has to understand what you meant by it, look at about 1 trillion documents, understand what they mean, understand how trustworthy they are, and match them together. And what's its purpose? It doesn't make a decision for you, but it surfaces what might be relevant to you and acts as a prosthesis for the fact that this horrible flaw we have that our memory and our knowledge isn't infinite. But again, these are devices specifically structured and built for the purpose of augmenting a capability rather than replacing it.
So why aren't we doing that more consistently across all of our problem statements? How can we have all these other cases where we're merging them together poorly? Is it an org situation where I don't have the right teams working together? Is it a governance? Is it a strategic problem? How do we do it better? How do we fix that?
Okay, so let me go back to the Compass case, I think, for an example of like why this goes horribly. So for those who haven't heard about this, Compass is a company that provided these wonderful AI tools to help judges make sentencing decisions. And as came out in an expose back in 2016, they were very systematic. They wanted to make sure they didn't have racial bias, so they didn't take race in as a parameter. Of course, they did take people's address, name, and income, which, especially if you're in, say, Broward County, Florida, is a really, really good proxy for race. And the slight problem is, of course, it wanted to predict recidivism. And the slight problem is that lights don't go off over people's heads when they commit crimes. So they used as a proxy arrests. And so what they actually did, they claimed they were predicting, is this person likely to commit a crime again? And what they were actually predicting is, who is the person most likely to be arrested for a crime? And the answer to that one is, of course, the black one, because, US. And this thing just ran roughshod over people's lives in huge volume. And even after the expose, I don't think they actually changed their practices in any horribly.
The Wisconsin Supreme Court upheld the use of this software,
And so the thing is, this is just egregious in all sorts of ways, but the decision, and so what happened here, this was advisory for judges, but quickly became essentially the thing making the decisions in practice. And people were really happy to delegate making this hard decision that they didn't want to make to a system where they knew it was probably actually doing something wrong, but they were actually okay with it doing something wrong because it was, penalizing black people more heavily, and it wasn't penalizing them more heavily because, again, we're in the US, and it basically surfaced that they were fine with it. People's values manifest in the decisions they make, and if they're using AI in a crappy fashion, that tells you about what's actually important to them at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I'll just add one point to that. There was a study from Dartmouth that found that this algorithm was no more accurate than Amazon Mechanical Turk workers, which are just random people on the internet performing the task. So it wasn't even a very, very good algorithm at all. And I think that some of what you have there is also just kind of this misalignment of incentives and values. This kind of private company is earning money off of this proprietary software that isn't very good. It's something that the public does not have much insight into. Often in court, such software is protected as proprietary trade secrets, so it's very hard for people to appeal or challenge its use. And I think that often the people kind of making, actually this is an example I think that gets it, this is kind of an existing problem in the US of kind of shady contractors getting lucrative government contracts and then not delivering well. And so in a way, this is just kind of like adding AI to that problem. And I think sometimes kind of also dazzling the people that you're selling to who may not be kind of have the data literacy to evaluate the claims that the company is making about this product they're selling.
And that, I think this is like the textbook. This will be in the textbooks when if textbooks still exist when this anyway. But I think what you're getting at is kind of the essence of the problem, right? Which is and the essence of the anxiety that some feel. That is to say, if a person's making the decision, there is a sense, rightly or wrongly, that you can hold that person accountable. And there is a sense, if it's an algorithm making the decision, that we don't have the tools to hold the algorithm accountable. And that's the moment we're in. That's why it's such a critical business issue if you're using algorithms across a variety of functions in the business, and why it's such a critical societal issue.
Yeah, it's funny. People use bureaucracy exactly the same way.
Well, but
and Dana Boyd makes this point that kind of throughout history, bureaucracy has been used to evade responsibility, and today algorithmic systems are basically extending bureaucracy, and so just making it even easier to evade responsibility with kind of one more place to point fingers.
So are you aware of anyone who's doing a good job of addressing that problem? So if there's an algorithm and it makes a bad decision, you're not going to send the algorithm to jail. Like what are we going to do? Do we provide recourse to an engineer? Do we provide recourse to a company? Is there a government entity? Like, how do we think about who's responsible for that decision? Anyone tackling that one?
I mean, lots of people are tackling this one, and I mean,
anyone doing it well?
Recourse is a question of systems, right? And with every system, there's a trade-off. So here's a classic example of the hard trade-offs. People have two huge complaints about abuse policies on social media. One of them is they keep failing to take things down quickly, even as like new threats emerge, and they don't like respond quickly enough. And the other one is their policies are opaque and there's no system of like recourse and precedent. So basically, you're saying that they need to be more closed, more fast executing, and be able to shift really rapidly, but also have completely open processes with case law and like judicial redress.
Right, and we're also making up the standards as we go.
Right, and I think the real answer is we are making this up as we go, and we have to develop systems of recourse as we go. But, I mean, that's not that it's fundamentally impossible to have a recourse any more than it is in a bureaucracy, right? It's just, we have to design systems, and I mean systems including people, that are appropriate to the individual cases.
Another case I would say is ProPublica discovered that on Facebook you could place an ad for an apartment and say, I don't want Black or Latino people to see this ad, which seems like a violation of the Fair Housing Act from the Civil Rights Movement. And this is something the original article came out. Facebook was like, oh, we're so sorry. Over a year later, ProPublica repeated the study, and it was still the case that you could do this. And then just this spring, I think that HUD did bring a suit against Facebook. And I mean, you can argue about the particulars of whether, it was severe enough to actually, it wasn't for Facebook to really suffer any penalty for kind of repeatedly doing this. But that is an example where I think it's kind of seems like, okay, well, like we had the mechanism in place, it just wasn't functioning properly.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit similar to this question that, and not really our subject tonight, but of AI-controlled weaponry. People say, oh my God, how will you deal with this and so on. With a bow and arrow, once I fire it, the arrow is flying on its own and might hit someone. We never think about blaming the arrow for hitting someone because that would be stupid. If you are deploying some kind of sophisticated artificially intelligent weapon and it starts killing people, you were the one who was deploying it. And so, I mean, to some extent you can say there is still a single neck you can throttle. But also, these questions of accountability, even when we say, I mean, there's two questions that I think we're slightly conflating here. There's recourse to fix the problem, and there is there someone who should be punished? And if you're asking that second question, you really need to go into the question of what exactly are you trying to achieve by punishment? Because already, I mean, if you think about the concept of, the legal concept of corporate personhood, there's already tremendous shields to make sure nobody gets punished for the most egregious things in our society. So, yeah. It's not an isolated issue.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really interesting point because we do think when a bad decision gets made and someone who should have gotten an opportunity to get hired doesn't get hired, or somebody who should have gotten a house doesn't get a house, like there is that desire for something needs to be done. There needs to be a punishment behind that. So there's the how do I fix it? How do I prevent it? How do I remediate? And then there's also should there be a punishment there? So I think it's fair to split those apart. Good point. So if we split those apart, I think the remediation angle is probably pretty clear, right? Like we kind of know what we have to do.
Yeah. It's hard, but it's sometimes hard, but it's clear.
The question becomes who's responsible. Like that to me is a really hard one.
Who's responsible in the sense of punishment? You mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that it's different than it has been in the respect that these systems are run by people. Yeah.
So the person,
right? There's people that run and build and design these things. Now, whether it's a corporate whatever or something like that, but ultimately there's a human in the loop, for the lack of a better word, in this thing, and how are those people? And I think this is part of this education process is that you can use bureaucracy as a point at that. You can use the system and point it at that, but the reality is it's about people, right? We have to hold the people accountable who are actually building and running these things. So.
Which, I mean, Jonathan brings up the great point that that's not something we're great at doing as an understatement. We're terrible at doing that in general, because I think a lot of also, to me, what feels upsetting about these high-profile, terrible cases is not just that they happen, but that people are earning a lot of money off of it, that these companies are very profitable. Another classic, or not classic, but case was software that was implemented to determine Medicaid benefits that had a bug that wrongly cut the hours of aid that people with cerebral palsy received. And so you had people that really needed home health aides that had their hours cut drastically. There was no recourse. They couldn't get an explanation. And that's something where this is a very profitable business. The software is used, I think, in over half of the 50 states. And I think that feels particularly egregious of like, these people are continuing to profit off of this.
Yeah.
Maybe to play devil's advocate here for a moment, which is a little bit weird coming from a chief ethical and humane use officer, but I think these are like huge and urgent problems. But we should also not lose sight of the fact that there are places where we've got algorithms working totally fine, and there are systems that kind of govern them, or they're transparent enough that people don't raise an eyebrow. So I was just thinking about the original core product of Salesforce, or our Sales Cloud service, right? Where the whole idea, the whole value out of that is salespeople are entering their data into that system, and there's an algorithm that's judging their success, and they know exactly what the ratio is that they're being measured at, and people, and they ask for that, right? And so I think there are ways, and that's obviously a much simpler example than some of the more advanced technologies that we're talking about. And so I don't want to, when you start talking about black box algorithms and it's a whole different conversation. But I also don't want to leave people with the impression that like this is this huge unsolvable problem, because I don't think it is.
Well, one of the things you brought up just twice right there was sort of the old sunlight is the best disinfectant argument. So are we just not doing a good enough job yet of explainability?
I think there's an issue with metrics can and will be gamed, and so sometimes there's a tension between kind of how much you reveal about your metrics and how much they're being gamed. And this is actually not distinct to technology either. An example from the UK, they passed a law saying that the success rates for surgeons would be published, and so heart surgeons began turning down high risk but necessary surgeries because they didn't want their rate dinged, and you have people that need surgery. And so I think a lot of there are many harmful effects that we see with tech that are kind of a result of these metrics gone wild, or putting too much too much stock in any one metric.
Yeah, I think explainability is a huge thing, right? We're still very early in the tool sets that allow you to understand the entire flow, and there's very few people on Earth who can correlate 100 million pieces of data and understand what happens at the bottom of it. I'm not one of them. But those tool sets of being able to visualize, to be able to test the systems, to be able to understand, those are just being built right now. There's very few out there, and I think that's a huge area of research. There's several interesting research projects going on right now to be able to do that. But I think that's an area that I think that we need to put a little more energy in. Actually, and funnily enough, one of the leaders in this is DARPA. So they have some of the very impressive research projects around this.
Well, I feel like I'd also hesitate about, I think on the one hand, explainability is incredibly valuable, incredibly important, really a thing we need to be pushing, but we also shouldn't consider it as a panacea.
No.
And that's both, I think, sort of two reasons. Like one, because people are actually incredibly bad at explaining their own decision-making process, but think they're incredibly good at it. And yet, what was that old paper? It turns out if you have someone hold either a cup of hot coffee or of ice water, and then meet someone, that person's perspective of their warmth and empathy will change radically. And it turns out it's actually because of the temperature of your hand. So first of all, people are actually very bad at explainability, and the other one is sunlight is not necessarily a good disinfectant. And if you've ever read Transmetropolitan by Warren Ellis, in the 90s when it was written, it was this piece of dystopian science fiction about incredibly corrupt politics where ultimately journalism saves the day. It's this amazing love song to journalism. And it's really depressing to read it nowadays because first of all, almost all of the science fiction just feels like the news. And second, at the end when, like, the journalist, I'm sorry, I might spoil a bit of this, but when the journalist reveals the horrible thing that the politician had done, and it can torpedo this politician's career, instead, nowadays, the politician would just go up there, make it part of his stump speech, and brag about it.
Yeah, going on that, there was a study of financial advisors that when they disclosed their conflict of interest, that actually made people more likely to trust them. As an example of, sunlight not necessarily working because people were like, oh, they're being forthcoming that they have a conflict of interest, and then made the bad investment anyway. And I totally agree with that. A point about, I think explainability is sometimes overemphasized or misleading just because humans are bad at explaining our decisions, and I think being human is kind of being a master of post hoc justifications. Like, this is what we evolved to do. And there's a risk with that for algorithms as well. There was an interesting paper on, I think they called it fair washing, but you could give a fairness criteria, and it was possible basically to back engineer a fairer algorithm than the one that actually came to the decision, but that would come to the same decisions as you had originally found, which is a real concern of, and something to keep in mind when considering algorithms.
So I want to make sure we have some time for this group to ask some questions, but can you, can we project forward a little bit? Can we, let's just think about these things are only going to get more sophisticated, they're only going to get more prevalent, they're only going to get further into your companies and outside your companies. What do we do? So now you're king for a day, queen for a day. You're going to wave the magic wand and say, here's where we should focus in order to mitigate some of the disaster scenarios that you've talked about and to emphasize some of the positives that you've talked about. So where do you focus?
My wife says I'm kind of a princess, so I'm not really sure. But, I'm not really keen. No, I mean, this to me comes back to education, right? People are, do you understand what you're doing, and do you understand it well enough? We try to make things easier for folks to do, but you have to have some sort of basis of understanding of what these systems are and how they work. And that's, I think, if we look at the future and things like that, that learning curve is steep, but people need to crawl up it, and if you don't, you don't really have the ability to even police yourself around when you're building this stuff.
So broad-based education across people who, so far we've just been taking these things from the experts, and now everyone's got to get smarter.
Yep.
Okay.
I do have that magic wand within my company.
So glad.
So just ask me tomorrow. I'll figure it out.
Thanks.
No, but really, that is my role, right? And so the things that we're focusing on are sort of building the capacity for predictive imagination and for the same types of risk schema that you might use for, say, security, for specific types of ethical issues that we might face, and building that into our roadmaps, and building that into kind of the muscle that all of our employees act with. And that's and thank you for the correction earlier. This is not day one. People have been thinking about these problems for a long time. How you translating that into practice is a major challenge, and it's super exciting.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I would just make a shout out to the Markula Center, which is an ethics center at Santa Clara University, and they have a tech ethics toolkit. This is for free on their website, and this is a group of ethicists that developed this, and it has kind of a number of practices you can incorporate into your processes, which I think is necessary. And so I know a key one of them is like ethical risk sweeping, which I think is similar to kind of what Paula was suggesting about this red teaming and really proactively trying to look for risk before they happen.
Yeah. I think there's sort of two things that we really need going forward. One of them is exactly what we're talking about here, this ethics that to basically build into the discipline of software engineering the same understanding of ethics, of risk, of safety, of so on that other branches of engineering learned 100 years ago. The other side, I think, goes to what we were talking about earlier about accountability and responsibility. We've done a really good job as a society of not having that at very large scales, and AI is just the latest thing making it visible, but I think that the deeper thing making it visible here isn't AI, it's there are the technological changes which are really shifting people's daily lives. There are the environmental changes, the economic changes. I mean, we are entering a period of time where we should be expecting the world's economy to start to really fall apart for environmental reasons, where we're seeing crazed right-wing governments taking over, and that is not the sort of thing that happens by coincidence. This is going to be a very troubled time, and I think that's what really highlights the significance and the importance of our lack of systems of accountability. I mean, either are having them or are not having them. And as long as we keep maintaining systems of entire social systems which perpetuate and accentuate and enable and reward that kind of thing, we are going to have trouble, and this will just be yet another tool to amplify that trouble by a lot.
So again, the algorithms are a symptom. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we should open it up, right? I want to make sure we get through everyone.
Hi. It seems like the elephant in the room is the data, that algorithms make their decisions based on data, and all of us are rapidly increasing the amount of data we have. What are the ethics behind how you choose to gather the data, and most importantly, repurpose data? That there's a lot of times we gathered it for this. Oh, look, we can not only spell check, we can see the pace of is he happy or sad, or lots of other things you could see. So what are the ethics around increasing gathering of data and repurposing of data?
Yeah, that's a great question. We definitely need to be thinking about consent of the people that we gather data from, and that includes them knowing how their data is going to be used. I would say also not gathering more data than is needed and thinking about how that data can be misused later. Another kind of very concerning trend is just increasing surveillance, and that data gathered for one purpose will be used for others. We've seen this recently with ICE accessing state driver's license databases, and kind of recognizing how surveillance throughout history has been used to try to squash movements for positive social change, and that any data gathered can be stolen or misused at a later point, to be very cautious and careful around that.
So we're going to close the doors and have a whole new panel just on that question.
Yeah, I think there might be like a sort of several parts to it too, because on the one hand, sort of in the very short term, we have with the GDPR and its increasing copying around the world, I think this idea of consent with regards to, or informed consent with regards to a named purpose, and concepts like this are going to become more widespread, and that's going to somewhat mitigate the direct issue raised. But I think that in the longer term, we're going to see some very deep changes happening in our society around the value of data and the use of data. I know even at dinner earlier, we were talking about the value of data, and I think about data in terms of economic value and things like that. I actually have a suspicion that right now we're going through this weird swing where the value of data is temporarily high because there's suddenly a lot of it, and there's a long history of data is valuable because it is scarce, because you know something that someone else doesn't. And now we're getting into some of the values of data that aren't tied to scarcity. But in the long term, I suspect we're going to see some kind of equilibrium and society coming to a different place. And I don't know what that place is going to look like. I always compare it to the problem of villages versus cities. In villages where everybody knows everybody else's business, and social norms built up around sort of the constructively not knowing things. We just think we know this, but we don't know this. Whereas in cities, there's a concept of anonymity, because the constructive not knowing doesn't scale when you have thousands and thousands of people. The whole concept of anonymity only emerges when people live in cities. It was another way of dealing with the problem of information, of literally, there are private facts that other people don't know about you. And now we're entering some kind of third situation where, well, you have the panopticon of a small village, but you don't have the strong social norms currently that manage how it works in a village. We're going to have to equilibrate somewhere, and I think in the long term, that's going to be the dominant effect for this.
Just one other point I want to say about that is Zeynep Tufekci, who's kind of like a foremost expert on socio-technical topics, has said, data privacy is a public good, and we need to think about it more as, like clean air, or, safe drinking water, and so that it's not something that can be governed by kind of all these individual decisions, which is how we're treating it now, which is a big topic for discussion, but just to also think about that framing as this is a public good.
And there's a third panel.
Yeah.
So I actually like a corollary to that, which is many times you get the algorithms basically end up accentuating the biases in the data. Is there any way of actually vetting the data to see that you can get what biases are inherent there?
It really comes down to analytical tools, counterfactuals, things like that. And so depending on what the data is and what the set looks like, and what sort of bias you're looking for and things like that, it's really, you have to go pick it apart and figure out how you can look at it and see. And there's also, when you're using your models and building your models, doing the kind of counterexamples and the extremes of and changing the data in different ways to see what happens to the model when you do that type of thing. So, it really comes down to testing and understanding what you have and being able to visualize it.
And a technique, so the gender shade study is something that got a lot of attention in the past year, but this is a researcher at MIT, Joy Balamwini, evaluated commercial computer vision products from IBM, Microsoft, Face++, and then Amazon in a follow-up study, and looked at their error rates on light-skinned men, light-skinned women, dark-skinned men, and dark-skinned women, and found that they were, the error rate was 40 times higher on dark-skinned women, and this was something that clearly the companies had not tested before releasing these products, and was kind of a, in theory it seems like this simple technique to look at these subgroups, but was very powerful.
Yeah. Of course, that also shows up all of the ways in which this is hard. One of the reasons why facial recognition on dark-skinned faces is hard is because of Shirley cards. Decisions made about how color film should be calibrated, which was made in the 1910s. So these were the standards used to determine what constitutes a good image, and they're called Shirley cards because it was a picture of a woman named Shirley, the original one. And until the 1970s, it was all white women. I think there were a few white men. And black and brown faces were added not because of racial inequality, but because of furniture manufacturers complained that they weren't getting good reproduction of pictures of wood. But to this day, it means that the normalization of the output of CCD cameras, even to this, is still really bad. And so if you look at photos of dark-skinned people, unless you actually understand the different theatrical lighting you have to use and different kinds of things you need to highlight them, pictures of dark-skinned people turn out terribly. They look like globs. And that has to do with these very deep decisions made a long-ass time ago.
Wait, somebody?
I don't necessarily have a question, but more of just what I've just gathered from you guys being up there. I teach a 300 student class over at Berkeley on the topic of cognitive science, which addresses topics like the nature of consciousness, the structure of language, implicit biases, which I think is a nice platform to have students really think about technologies that they'll be going into. Many of the students go work at Google and Facebook and all these tech companies, but what's the use of building these products if you're unable to question the social and ethical implications to them? And I took it upon myself to include an ethics piece to it. It wasn't required by the university. In fact, most of the majors there don't really have an ethics component. So what I do every semester is to have my 300 undergraduates watch Black Mirror. Black Mirror as a homework assignment, to use that as a conversational piece to talk about these social ethical implications, because many of them will be going to tech, and I feel like it's a little bit disheartening that some of the things that we're talking about were becoming reactive rather than proactive. So as an educator, I think Warren and Rachel, you talked about education and resources. Is there anything more that I can do and other instructors and educators can do to really train the new generations of tech practitioners, ethicists, all of that, so that they're the ones who can also make an impact? Because if you look around this room, the demographic is, don't you wish, I kind of wish that there should be more young people here who will eventually be working in the areas that you guys will eventually be working in. So my question is, is there anything more that we can do to really educate the next generation of, tech practitioners and ethicists to really make a difference? So that's it.
One resource I can flag for you that I worked on in my previous role before I joined Salesforce is we worked with Mozilla and a handful of others, Craig Newmark, to fund a community of practice of educators integrating, especially in computer science, but integrating ethics directly, not as like a side module, but like into core curriculum. And so there's if you look at the Mozilla website, there's a whole set of open source resources that they're creating that can be helpful, and I think more importantly, this community that is forming around that.
Yeah. In fact, two things I might add to this one. One of them, in fact, it's one of the people who was awarded one of these grants, and I'm so embarrassed, I can't remember her name. She's a professor at the University of Colorado.
Casey Fiesler.
Casey Fiesler, yes. She has this, in fact, if you search for her paper on the Black Mirror method, she's actually been, the Black Mirror Writer's Room, I think it's called, is the name of the exercise she puts her students through. It is one of the best designed exercises for teaching people ethical thinking I've ever seen, and it's based on similar things.
Yeah, she frames it as speculation is this skill that kind of we need to learn and practice. And so, yeah, she has students create a Black Mirror episode.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd point out, so I started out as a physicist. There are no ethics classes in a physics curriculum, but ethics is a nonstop subject of discussion. I think that's it's the after effect of the field after Hiroshima. And I know that chemists have very similar things. For them, it was chemical weapons, and before that, dynamite. When it gets wired into a field, it's not even that it's like part of the syllabus sometimes. It's that that's what you're talking about at lunch and at dinner. Like every day is like, would you do this? Would you do that? How do you feel about this? So building up that conversation even beyond the classroom, I think, has a really big impact.
And just two more resources I would mention. Casey Fiesler has also put together a crowdsourced spreadsheet of over 200 tech ethics courses with links to their syllabi, which is almost like too much, but it's really neat. And I know she's kind of doing some meta-analysis on their contents now. And then I wanted to make a shout out to Chris Wiggins, who's a professor at Columbia University and also the chief data scientist of the New York Times. But he has a course that he co-teaches with a history professor on the past, present, and future of data. And everything's available on GitHub for this, and it goes through kind of all these historical developments. I didn't know this regression was first introduced to do race science, and these really kind of horrible applications, and covers the Tuskegee syphilis trial, and just kind of all these ethical failures really in statistics and science up through the present day, and I think that's a really interesting framing as well.
Question?
Yes, hi, my name is Thierry Doyen from Cloud4Y. I just wanted to throw something, maybe artificial intelligence was a cool name, but maybe something like knowledge machine would be less scary for the public. But what I wanted to ask is, it's great to hear all we're talking about, because here we're really conscientious about what we do, but I'm really afraid of AI in rogue nations, in rogue people, rogue organizations, and what are your thoughts on that, and is there a way that we can prevent it ending in the wrong hands and really causing damage? Because it has the power.
Yes, that one.
I mean, really cynical part of me says, look at the non-rogue nations who have it. I'm kind of worried about them too.
Yeah. Sorry. We're just pointing out he's been waiting for a bit.
Oh.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask about, apropos of what you were saying, about the importance of the free and open exchange of ideas, and ideas that aren't necessarily owned, like ideas in physics or in fundamental research. Somehow, with this problem with secrecy and ownership of information, at universities there already are problems with people talking about AI at conferences. Some faculty I know have to take precautions and use the university's laptop instead of their own laptop. And there's this whole culture that's kind of against the free and open exchange of ideas around AI and sharing it. So I wanted to ask if there's anything going on to counter that in academia and in research.
I would say, on the whole, I have found the AI community to be relatively open, and particularly, I mean, this has shifted even in the last few years. Jeremy and I were talking earlier about when we started Fast.ai, feeling like people weren't sharing a lot of the practical info, but now there are a lot of great resources out there, and that in general, I feel like the machine learning community is responding to, open sourcing more code and like sharing more of what they're doing. And I mean, Archive, this place where people freely share papers, is very, very heavily used. So I think there are a lot of positive trends there.
I was thinking more like physicists.
Oh, physicists, okay.
People who are now legally, there's stuff going on in Washington where they travel. She's saying because it won't show up on the video otherwise.
The question was about physicists or chemists being legally prohibited.
I think that in a lot of these cases, academia is pretty far behind in a lot of the space. I think like most of the most interesting stuff is happening in industry nowadays, and it's much more acute a situation there. And actually, I think one of the biggest problems we've had in a place where actually something like the Churchill Club can make a really big difference, there's a really big need for practitioners in fields like respectful computing, like people who work in privacy, abuse, security, all of these things, to be able to talk, share notes, compare things, and they need really strong conditions of secrecy in order to be able to do so, because everything you say will show up in the newspaper and in court filings and so on and so forth. So I think there really is a very big need for more fora in which so it won't be open public discussion. It can't be under these circumstances, but at least more discussion so that you can form a community of practitioners.
I will share another area where I think there's difficulties is for researchers who are looking at often kind of harmful impact of major tech companies, have trouble accessing the data. And I saw a tweet the other day about how it's easier for marketers to buy this data than for academic researchers that are trying to hold companies accountable to access it. And I know the Knight Foundation has a petition out that a number of top researchers have signed, but that is kind of an issue of allowing for responsible research, but also research that could help hold tech companies accountable.
Half an hour later, right? Yeah, here we are. There you
But
go.
it's okay. Yeah, it's okay. I'm patient. So my name is Jason Ma. I want to ask you this very probably we all play in a global village, correct? So you guys are ethical companies, and I commend you for that. And I do believe that you do implement ethics and integrity in what you do as leaders in your field. But you know that looking at the world out there, China, Russia, etc., and a lot of nations are being very aggressive in investing and promoting and going for AI, machine learning, etc. Now, when it comes to ethics and integrity, you know that certain nations out there and certain players out there, they may not have our integrity level or ethics level, right? And they're being very aggressive in advancing their AI and machine learning initiatives. So I would love to hear perspective or strategies or mindset from each one of you on how you and your company and how are you influencing your ecosystem to try to not lose advantage while doing well by doing good. Does that make sense to you?
So maybe I'll speak to one part of the question, which is to say, I think the reason why we take this so seriously is we believe not only will it help us avert risk in the future, but that it'll actually add value to the company, right? And so we know that if we're at a panel, we're all sitting around talking about how do you govern and manage algorithms? Our customers are thinking about that too, and they want our help, right? And so if we pay attention to that question, both for how we manage ourselves and how we offer features to them, it's actually gonna accrue to our bottom line, right? So I think sometimes there's this framing of well, either you're ethical or you're profitable, choose. And I feel like that framing, which is not really what you said, but I hear it a lot, and I think it's unhelpful, because I think there's in this moment of turbulence, ethical leadership is what's gonna have your stock continue to go up as opposed to take constant hits because of crises in the newspapers.
Yeah. I think it's sort of in the context of my work, we have an even more amplified version of this because we know that, we are working on making work better, so we actually work with companies to help improve their culture and their environment and their working environment. And all of these things that Paula said are true for our customers as well as for us. So if we can help them achieve that, then that actually directly creates value for them. So that's, I think, our way of trying to influence our ecosystem and the world around us, and basically why we founded the company is because we wanted to do that. Although I don't think that necessarily speaks to the earlier part of your question when you start talking about China, Russia, et cetera, and of course we had the earlier question about that. That's a very different question, and it goes to deeper issues where you have fundamentally incompatible goals, not just incompatible means. And of course, we can talk about Chinese history and exactly why Xi views artificial intelligence and the use of social control in certain ways, and what are the trade-offs that are on his mind and on the minds of the Politburo. I can understand where they are coming from, even if I do not necessarily think that they are right and think they're going to achieve something very horrible in the process. I don't have a magic tool for fixing that.
Two things I would say about this. One, I do want to highlight that I have a lot of concerns within the U.S. as well, and technologies like Amazon's Ring doorbell, which is partnered with over 400 police departments. This is a kind of smart camera doorbell, but has this very kind of murky private-public partnership that's being subsidized by taxpayer money, and some police officers involved have said that they can get the data from Amazon without a warrant. There's a lot of kind of question of like what exactly is going on here, and those sorts of trends worry me within the U.S. But I would agree that there is kind of when you talk about the issues with Russia or China or other nations, that I think particularly in areas like disinformation is a huge issue. And Renee DiResta, who's kind of a top expert on computational propaganda, has said that we need to think of disinformation not as about determining true or false, but about it's a cybersecurity issue and looking at manipulative and bad actors, and that has had an impact. Research has linked Russia to anti-vaxxing propaganda, which has had a concrete effect in the U.S. and Europe, and so it is like a very real issue.
I think we have time for one more.
Hi, Weber from NES. My question is, do you think the way the corporate America is structured today, we are ready to operationalize ethics in AI? Who do you think is the ideal title to kind of champion these kind of initiative? Is it Chief Digital Officer, Chief Innovation Officer, Chief HR, or it has to come from the CEO?
I think there's someone who has a title right there. Yeah, right?
Well, and there too.
That's right.
But that said, I would say that the ideal title is actually engineer and product manager and shelf stalker. And I mean, if you have a single salesperson very much. Yes. If you have a single person who's responsible for this, you're already in trouble. I mean, the CEO is responsible for it because the CEO is responsible for all of the culture at the company. But
it's a culture of ethics, right? It's not a single person. A single person's not going to be able to do it. You have to have the buy-in from the organization, and everybody's got to have, some part in playing in how they ethically run businesses. I don't think that's new. I think it's just we're seeing more concern about it now.
Anyone else on this one? Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives so candidly. We really appreciate it very much. We have a small token of our appreciation for you, and it is, of course, the Churchill Club speaker T-shirt.
Thank you.
You wear that in very good health. Our next program coming up is the 12th of September, the Churchill's event, as we look at fine examples from our community of collaboration, leadership, innovation, and societal good, work for societal good. We have John W. Thompson coming, people from Zoom, Slack, and Peloton, as well as Carl Gordino from the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. And then on the 16th of September, Brad Smith is coming down, the president of Microsoft, to talk about his perspectives about how companies need to be responsible for the collateral effects of technologies that they are developing. So hope you'll join us for those. We have actually lots more before the end of the year, so please keep an eye on us. You have been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much. See you next time. Good night.